wanted to see, and we hope that the international community would provide help for the Libyans to overcome distrust between them and in finding common ground without any attempts to enforce ready-made solutions from outside, or perhaps to prioritize one Libyan side over the other. We are concerned by the fact that the new UN Secretary General Special Envoy for Libya has not yet been appointed. And here, our American colleagues are trying to stall this decision, and they practically ignore the position of the African Union, and they try to dictate their own conditions and refuse to find some common ground with other participants. The situation in Libya can be improved should the oil industry in Libya restart its activities. The decision was made by the leaders of the Libyan National Army and the representatives of the Tripoli administration. The main thing here is for the hydrocarbon export revenues to be distributed justly and transparently for the benefit of the entire population of Libya and would be efficiently used for economic recovery. We are also seriously concerned by the situation in the Persian Gulf. As you know, President Putin has recently proposed to hold an online meeting between the UN Security Council permanent members and Germany and Iran. This proposal saw that we need to set the steps which would allow us to settle the parameters of joint work on building a sound system of collective security in the Persian Gulf. Many years ago, Russia has presented a concept of ensuring security in the Persian Gulf area, and last summer we have updated this strategy and we have presented it to the international community and released it in the Security Council. We have also organized a discussion at the ministerial level in the December of this year. And if we are talking about the MENA region, it is important to resolve all the conflicts I've mentioned and other conflicts as well. Let's not forget about the Yemen conflict. It is hardly possible to stabilize the situation in the region while such an old wound as the Arabo-Israeli conflict has not healed. We are following the process of normalization of relations between Israel and certain Arab countries. We believe that any rapprochement is positive, but we believe that such developments should not be used as the substitute for the settlement of the Palestinian issue on the basis of the commonly recognized international and legal basis. We need to unite international efforts for the swift relaunch of direct Palestino-Israeli negotiations so that Israel would refrain from unilateral actions, and I'm talking first and foremost about their settlement activities and their illegal practice of destroying Palestinian homes on the West Bank. Here, I cannot help but mention the worrying situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. We believe any actions that might lead to the increase of conflicts are unacceptable. Efficient dispute resolution can be carried out on the universal platform of the United Nations, and the mechanisms for the delineation of exclusive economic zones and continental shelf is enshrined in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, and we should make use of these mechanisms. Using this opportunity, I would like to underscore we are not against, including in this region, of implementing energy projects which are aimed at diversifying gas supplies to Europe. At the same time, we refute any attempts to politicize cooperation in this area. The choice should be made by the consumer countries themselves and should be based on the logic of free competition, economic feasibility, and economic benefits, and not under the pressure of ultimatums and threats which we hear from the West. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it is in our common interest to do our best so that the Mediterranean would not be a place for confrontation, but rather a link between the North and the South. And people living here would live in prosperity and in peace. It's hard to achieve this goal, but it is possible if we will act together. Russia will continue to promote these processes. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Lavrov. Thank you very much for your introduction. I think that now we will focus on a couple of main issues, and let me pick up from your remarks. You were mentioning the different places of crisis around the Mediterranean. Now let's have a look together for a second to the United States. How do you assess what's happening in the United States? How do you see and project your relations towards the new Biden administration that will be in power starting from January?
I'm aware that this topic has been covered during your event, during some of the discussions. I tend to agree to some experts, specifically those who think that the incoming administration that will be inaugurated in January will be basically forced to provide the continuity of the current foreign policy. What we're seeing right now is that the United States are mostly focused on the domestic agenda. Namely, that is the unprecedented scale of the pandemic impact in the United States, but also the need to restart the economy of the country, which is basically was struck down by the crisis, by the virus. And clearly, every administration have to heed to the deep polarization of the country when 75 million of the citizens were voting for the current president, for the incumbent. And equally, approximately the same amount voted for Joe Biden, which basically says that the society is split in half. And it is the duty of any administration to try to restore the former national unity. I think that foreign policy agenda will still be there. The United States will still have to deal with foreign policy. But look at it this way. For 4 years, the United States have been demanding from their allies to share the burden and the foreign affairs. So I think this policy will continue. So against this backdrop, we are more specifically interested in what Europe will do to respond to this. We are aware that President Macron is promoting the strategic independence of the European Union concept. Granted, there are different views upon this concept. And I think even speakers of your distinguished forum have voiced different opinions about it, about whether Europe is ready or not to be an independent pole of power, or should it pick the side and choose the transatlantic solidarity. These are the opinions that we're hearing, we're listening to.
Lavrov?
This is a trend that will play out, and we'll have to see what happens.
No, it happens just that you made a long speech, so I have to ask you to be a little bit shorter in the answers. And there is a translation?
Well, I think I finished answering your question. So if you have any clarifications or questions, I can...
Yes, I have it. There is a paradox in your relations with Turkey. On one hand, you constantly have to deal with this country, but you start from opposite sides. it is an adversary in Libya, on the Nagorno-Karabakh, in Syria. On the other hand, your country provides to Turkey military equipment, in particular the SS-400 missiles. How can you explain this paradox, being Turkey a member state of the NATO alliance?
So the question is,
to explain the paradox that you sell weapons to a NATO member and that you have frequent relationships with Turkey, although you are on opposite sides in more than one crisis, in Libya, in Syria, and Nagorno-Karabakh too.
Let me tell you this. Take any two countries. You can take any two NATO member states. You will see many counterintuitive things. You can see many paradoxes there, many contradicting trends that can be points of concern. We have no contradiction in principle with Turkey. And by the way, we are celebrating a 100th anniversary of relationship with Turkey. I'm referring to the current republic, which was founded in the year 1920. It is true, we have a shared history. Some of pages of this history were positive, some of them were negative. But currently, our presidents have managed to articulate a model of cooperation that help us to address our differences. It's just not possible for any country to be completely unanimous with the rest of the world. There will be points of disagreement. I mean, look at the European Union. There are well-known Russophobic countries that are trying to impose their own views and policy to the rest. No two countries in the world will ever be 100% agreeing on 100% of the cases, which is exactly the case of the European Union. But that's beside the point. I think that if countries are ready to promote their national interests and work with one another, they can build a model of cooperation and somehow balance their interests. And a Russia-Turkey relationship is a case in point. Our cooperation is built exactly upon these principles of good neighborly relationship, taking each other's interests on board. Besides, we have multi-billion investment projects that span energy and other economic areas, including the cooperation in military and technical field. That is to say, we have promising plans on foreign policy coordination of our activity. I think the most graphic example is exactly Syria, where Russia, together with Turkey and Iran, have formed the Astana format, which has proven to be the most viable mechanism for facilitating the crisis resolution in Syria. It is exactly the Astana format against the backdrop of complete inaction of the United Nations, represented back then by my good friend, Stefan de Mistura. It is exactly Astana format that proved itself to be a successful format. United Nations was inefficient and inactive, and we are actually welcoming the Turkish contribution in this format. So many arrangements on the Astana format are actually followed up on the ground. I'm referring, for instance, to the de-escalation effort. Just as we agreed with our Turkish partners, the influence of extremists are losing influence gradually and continuously. It is true that there are eastern territories in Syria where the United States actively pushing Kurds toward greater degree of separatism. It is true. There are certain hotspots that still are not under control of the Syrian government, but as a whole, Turkey agrees with us on the principles of the resolution 2254. Now, turning to Libya, it is true that we have different approaches to the situation with Turkey. We are in contact with all the parties to the conflict. Turkey prefers to make an emphasis on its relationship with the Tripoli administration. But look at the whole picture. I think that our broad influence, ours and Turkish and other parties on the parties to the conflict, helps us to secure better results when we work together. I'm referring to the cessation of hostilities in many other areas. Now, turning to Nagorno-Karabakh, it's no secret that we disagree. We have disagreed with Turkish actions in the beginning of the conflict when Ankara was saying that there is a military solution to the conflict. We were never agreeing to this. But look at the situation now. Thanks to the efforts of President Putin, thanks to his contacts with the leaders of Azerbaijan and Armenia, an agreement was done on November 9, and according to this agreement, a conflict resolution center will be put in place, will be operational quite soon. It will base its analysis on the drone intelligence. So let me be straight. Russia and Ankara, in all of these cases, are finding common ground and finding ways to find synergy, to compound our efforts. And this is exactly the case of Nagorno-Karabakh. We have used our strengths to come together and to work together to a greater success. So I think the relations between Russia and Turkey is exactly the case of this. When two independently thinking, two clear-eyed countries are working together, who pursue their own policy, not bending, not caving to some ultimatums and pressure from without. So its membership in NATO is not any obstacle to us.
Mr. Minister, obviously, time is running against us because I would like to speculate with you quite a lot.
There is something that's going on. Well, sorry, Mr. Lavrov. About Libya, the military committee that have inside representative of President Fayez al-Sarraj and of General Khalifa Haftar reached an agreement and for an exit of foreign forces from Libya. Did you talk about with Turkish interlocutors? And from your point of view, what should change about the private military contractors of the Wagner organization that comes from Russia?
Ну, я предложил бы вам не забывать, что...
Well, let me remind you this. I think it's soon be 6 months since there are no open hostilities in Libya. And to a great extent, this is exactly the result of coordination of actions between Russia and Turkey. The coordination of actions that was in place for quite a while. Right before the Berlin conference, Moscow hosted the meeting of ministers, the Libyan leadership represented by Mr. Sarraj and Mr. Saleh, and Marshal Haftar as well. So this meeting gave a momentum to the further positive dynamic that was followed up on the Berlin conference. So this conference eventually led to the cessation of hostilities in this summer, which was later actually formalized and memorialized in the 5+5 format. So it would be imprudent and unfair to say that Russia supports Haftar and Turkey supports Sarraj. I think it's a very primitivist approach. And any decent analyst would say that this is exactly the oversimplification. You know, there was one sage who said that finding common grounds with friends is actually easier than finding common grounds with people of other values.
Well, you can ask all the NATO members to condemn Russia for certain activities, as Jens Stoltenberg does with all the members of the NATO alliance. But the basis of diplomacy is not to say, yes, sir, I'm going to follow your orders, but to find a way to combine the interests and the opportunities of all the foreign players to influence various parties to the conflict. I believe that in Libya, we, Turkey, and all the other foreign players managed to do just that.
Diplomacy is also don't describe the reality exactly as it is sometimes. But Monica, do you have another questions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. But I know that time is running against us. But let me just ask you, Mr. Lavrov, Minister, do you think that 2021, so next year, could be the year of the breakthrough in Syria? You mentioned Syria in your remarks, but really on the ground, is there something happening that makes you hopeful of what's going on?
On the ground in Syria, we see some radical changes going on. The most dangerous period of this crisis has passed, and the Syrian government, with the support of their friends, including the Russian Federation, has not allowed the terrorists to seize power in the country. Back in 2015, until at the end of September, Russia sent its military contingent to Syria in order to help the legitimate government. Before that, in August of 2015, the terrorists were basically at the borders of Damascus, and most of our Western friends, in response to the calls for national dialogue, have basically remained silent, hoping that the terrorists would stage a coup d'etat, and with the help of terrorists, they would be able to achieve the goal, which was proclaimed by the US and their European allies. That is the change of the regime. This was not the first time when terrorists were used for achieving geopolitical goals. This was the case in Afghanistan. This was the case in Libya. And that's what they attempted to have in Syria. And we have not allowed this to happen. And now the territories under the control of terrorists who have declared caliphate and had ISIS in power and have captured square kilometers of territories in Syria, this is non-existent these days. As for the year 2021, it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. For example, all the forecasts for 2020 were wrong, I would guess. So I would not like to make any forecasts, but we have a sound plan of action. The Constitutional Committee is functioning right now, and the task of recovering Syrian economy is in place, and I believe this task would be resolved regardless of the attempts of our Western colleagues to suffocate Syrian economy and to achieve the goal of changing the regime. I do not believe that this is a long-term feasible strategy. I do not believe it is in line with the interests of the EU. I do not believe that this is in line with the interests of the Mediterranean countries.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lavrov. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks to Monica Maggioni and to all of you for being with us. All the best for you